have two fantastic speakers with us today. Carly Kind from the Ada Lovelace Institute and Christine Elliott from the College of Policing. And Carly is the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is an independent research body and a think tank, which works around ensuring data and artificial intelligence work for people and society. So a really great kind of social science approach for us in terms of looking at technology. And Christine Elliott is the interim chair, I think, of the College of Policing. And she was also its first independent director, and has senior chairing and non-executive experience in this kind of role. And what we're going to do today is we'll have Carly speaking first with a presentation, followed by Christine. And then at the end, we'll take some questions, comments, discussion. And the way that we're going to run this, if you can please, in the chat function, if you can pop your comments and questions there, and then at the end of the two presentations, we'll go through those, try and group them together if there are things in a particular theme, and put those to Carly and to Christine. And I should say, sorry, as I forgot to introduce myself, which I always seem to do. My name's Jackie Hodgson. I'm a professor in the law school here at the University of Warwick. I'm also a Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, and I'm the co-director, along with Dr. Kim Wade in psychology, of the Centre for Operational Police Research, COPR. So a very warm welcome to you all, and we're really looking forward to this. So I think it's now over to you, Carly.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming along in what I'm sure is many people's last week of work before taking a much deserved break from work. My name is Carly Kind. I'm the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, and we are an interdisciplinary research institute and deliberative body with, as Jackie said, a remit to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And that means that we're interested in the societal impacts of using new technologies, in particular data-driven technologies, in policy making, in governing, and also in the private sector. And we try to understand what the ethical issues are that arise. And we also try to bring the voice of the public into policy debates. So we do a lot of work on public engagement and public deliberation. So we run citizens' juries and assemblies, which are kind of long form focus groups with members of the public to try to engage them on some of the thorny questions around the use of technology. We don't do a lot of work in policing. So today I'm mostly going to speak about some research we've been doing and work we've been doing around COVID and what I think are some of the takeaways from that that might be relevant to the domain of policing. As a backup, I've already been through that. As a kind of history of the work we have done, last year we worked quite a lot on facial recognition systems, and that was obviously responding to quite a lot of public discussion and press around facial recognition in the UK, including the Metropolitan Police's rollout of facial, or trials as they were last year, and then rollout in January of facial recognition. We commissioned the first major survey on public attitudes to facial recognition in the UK, and we surveyed more than 4,000 people about how they approached the use of facial recognition in certain use cases. So we looked at policing, but we also looked at transport and airports, supermarkets, job interviews in schools, to try to understand how the public changes their levels of comfort with facial recognition when it's deployed in different contexts. And you can find that survey on our website if you're interested. And since then, we've been doing a few things around facial recognition. We've commissioned an independent legal review to understand how do new biometrics technologies need us to require an update of our legal framework. We've commissioned a biometrics council, which is 60 members of the public thinking about facial recognition and other biometrics technologies. And we've also been advocating around a voluntary pause on further deployments of facial recognition while we work through some of these legal and ethical questions. And that's just a little more information about the Citizens Council, which is 60 members of the public in Bristol and Manchester, and which will report at the end of this year. So since COVID started, we have put aside the work on facial recognition to follow the development of technology in the context of the response to the crisis, and in particular around the exit from the crisis. As you will know, from about March or April this year, the government started discussing how different technologies could be deployed, such as symptom tracking apps and contact tracing apps, in order to supplement the pandemic response. In April, we published this report, which is a rapid evidence review around different technologies that were being debated or developed to aid in the exit from the crisis. And we found at that time that there was insufficient evidence to support the further rollout of contact tracing apps, among others, as of April 2020. The types of issues we looked at and assessed were questions around the design of contact tracing apps, how they would be incorporating different types of data, how data would be collecting, how it would be accessed, etc. And we looked at the technical limitations of contact tracing apps, their vulnerability to fraud and abuse. We also looked at barriers to deployment, things like how do you establish public trust, and how do you ensure that potentially harmful behavioural impacts such as disincentivizing compliance with social isolation as a result of contact tracing apps might flow from their use. And we looked at social considerations that would need to be built into the design of the app, including paying attention to digital exclusion and those who suffer from other inequalities. And we kind of set out a system that we thought the government should follow in order to deploy the contact tracing app, which married a kind of technical efficacy with building legislation and strategy that would increase public trust and transparency around the use of the app, and building in oversight and monitoring as well. We also ran in May of this year an online public deliberation with 30 members of the public, where we met regularly over the course of 3 weeks, 7 meetings over 3 weeks with a diverse group of members of the public from Kent and London. They represented very different political views, backgrounds, demographics, and we were both interested in the methodology of how you engage members of the public in online deliberation during a lockdown, but also we put to them a question of how would you build public confidence around the use of a contact tracing app that the government were then considering developing. And we had some really useful insights from that I think are applicable to all government public sector use of technologies, and I think in particular are useful to the context of tech in policing. So we asked the members of the public to articulate values that they thought were important around the use of tech in the context of COVID. I don't think many of those will be much of a surprise to people. For example, the idea that there should be data security and privacy. But I think things that are particularly important are the emphasis on personal choice and the need for technologies to be temporary rather than mandatory. So the idea that people want an option to choose to opt out. And that's actually, interestingly, a finding we saw echoed around facial recognition, which was, even though there was quite a high level of comfort of police using facial recognition systems, but above about 70% of people said that they were comfortable with police using facial recognition. A large number of people also said they wanted the option to opt out of facial recognition where possible. So that idea of personal choice being still very important. There was also an emphasis on protecting the vulnerable and the idea of there being equity and equality. And an interesting question that came up quite a lot is, are we in this together? Is this something that everybody has to do together? And I think that echoes other findings we've had on other similar issues, which is this notion that technology shouldn't exacerbate inequalities between the old and the young, the rich and the poor, or around geographical lines, and that we need to use technology in a way that kind of levels up everybody at the same time. And I think in the context of policing, that's an important finding, because given that police forces operate independently across the country, there is public discomfort with the idea that in one area you would be subject to something that you wouldn't be subject to in another area. And I think that's something really to consider. So there was a real emphasis from the public on the need to build the evidence base. They wanted to know, does this work, and how is it going to affect the pandemic response? What proof do we have that contact tracing can be effective? how can we understand how this fits into the wider strategy? So there was an emphasis on the system, the whole system, not just the piece of tech itself. And data and security and privacy were issues that were raised, but they certainly weren't at the top of the agenda as they're sometimes portrayed to be. It was more, can we trust the use here? Is it going to be effective? Is it going to work? And is everybody going to benefit from it? Questions that were raised around how do we know it works? How do we build the evidence base? Are we in this together, as I said? And then will my privacy be compromised? How safe and secure is the data? And we had some great ideas from the members of the public about how to build confidence in this type of technology. And I think lots of these are useful for a policing context as well. So emphasis on the need for independent review and assessment. So independent ethics committee was favoured by lots of the participants. Risk assessments, impact assessments, these types of audit processes, all of that process really does improve public trust and confidence in a tech system. Then a focus on whole systems thinking. So how does this fit within the broader strategy around the pandemic response? You know, are there other policy interventions that need to be put in place to make sure this works? So an example would be, a premise of the contact tracing app is that if you get a notification from your app saying you've been in contact with someone who has now reported symptoms or been tested positive for COVID, you need to self-isolate for up to 14 days. Do we need policies in place to give people the economic support in order to comply with that type of self-isolation measure? Are their employers going to understand that they got a notification from an app and now they need to stay home? And what protections are in place to ensure that they can do that, that they can comply? And then finally, clear boundaries and clarity around data rights and responsibilities. People wanted to know, you know, exactly how long is my data being kept for? When is it going to be deleted? Who can have access to it? There was an interesting focus on how do you know if you've been categorized and classed within a certain group, and how could you overcome that? And I think that reflects some people's concerns about like being scored or otherwise within these predictive analytics systems and getting stuck in the system. Can you somehow get outside of that? And then lastly, just to say, there was very clear concern about the use of data for commercial benefit. So I think this echoes other findings, which is people generally trust government institutions in Britain. They trust the NHS first and foremost, but they also trust police and other government arms of the government, but they trust companies a lot less. So how can we ensure that they feel satisfied that their data isn't going to end up in the hands of companies? So I hope that some of those are useful learnings for this conversation. I'll stop there and let Christine speak now.
Great. So if you, any questions that you have before you forget them, if you want to pop those in the chat, that would be great. And now if we move on to Christine, thanks very much.
Great, well, thanks. I will also share screen. We'll see what version I get, Carly. That was really stimulating. Thank you. And it's completely timely because the Police Foundation has just published a report which flags up, you know, some of the same concerns about policing. It's basically talking about the future of policing, and this first stage of it, it's in 2 stages. This first stage is a review, and then it's moving on to, so what will the response to the review be? So the work that you've been doing, you know, really should play into all of that, and I will certainly, if I can, help to make sure that it does. So I'll share my screen, hopefully. So I'll do just brief intros, and I'll try not to replicate anything that Carly's said. But for those people who don't know, the college has 3 complementary functions. In the knowledge area, what we're trying to do is improve evidence of what works by developing research and infrastructure. Education, we set standards, and the whole point of these is to address what's a big issue in the 43 forces, which is providing some level of consistency. That is not in any sense sort of taking away the leadership of the forces, but it does address some of the issues that Carly said, which is you might get the equivalent of postcode lottery So what kind of, do we have postcode policing? How is it going to vary by area? Now, obviously, policing has to be locally responsive, but there are some national norms. We also, and I'm very keen about this, provide accreditation and recognition for the vast amount of experience and learning that police already have. They, you know, kind of assume that they don't have that in the same way as whatever degree equivalency or other qualifications, but people who make it into the early stages of policing already have a lot of experience. It needs to be recognised. And thirdly, standards, again, drawing on what works and providing authorised professional practice is one example. And we are about to issue something refreshed on stop and search. Clearly our focus over the last 6 months has shifted because of COVID, but at the same time, we have not been distracted from the 3 priorities that I set with the board and the leadership of the college and the blessing of the Home Secretary: digital diversity and leadership at all levels. So I wanted to start, you know, sort of looking at what our response has been during the pandemic. And so the sort of stuff that we've done, we've had a hub that explains the new powers. And I know everybody's been in the same boat here, but often we, like everybody else, would hear something in the 5 o'clock briefing, and over a weekend, working with others in policing, would have to produce new guidance and very specific stuff as well. Particularly around the nature of changing crimes. We have put together something that people said before COVID was impossible and wouldn't be accepted, but an online assessment process that first evaluation is showing is fair, effective and inclusive. But I'd like to stress that it's not just important to recruit, it's really important to retain as well as to attract, and that involves genuine inclusion, all the thought around the police covenant and emphasis on well-being. So from September, we'll also be delivering an online platform that enables exams. So those promotion exams which had been delayed because of COVID. And I think importantly, we've got to drive on certain levels of supervision, and so we're introducing a 3-day tutor constable classroom-based course, and that's, you know, predicated on bite-sized knowledge, self-directed learning, and that's the foundation for which is our knowledge hub, and we deliver via Skype. Plus, I would like to mention our innovation broker network. We are constantly looking, and we've been mapping these across the country, for pockets of innovation in policing, and they exist everywhere. And we'd like to see which of those can actually be made mainstream for the future. So, kind of in development, what is the college doing right now? We've got professional development of the Digital Policing Foundation. This includes new entrants, initial constable learning, the police education qualifications framework, and that supports investigative programs and upskilling existing frontline officers and staff. There's something that we acronym for, which is the DII. So that is the Digital Intelligence and Investigation. And that actually is a hub. And I'm conscious here that the version of the presentation that I appear to have is not the one that I'd like to be presenting against. There are a few things missing, so I'll kind of cover those as I go along. But we've got also some guidance and codes that help to manage risk. And one of those, which I know has been quite controversial, is a draft code of practice for the law enforcement services, the replacement for the old National Police computer. And one of the difficulties here has already been flagged up by Carly. That is the fact that what happens to this data. Where does it go? How long is it kept for? Who's going to be using it? Is it held in some kind of Orwellian national repository where authorized organizations can access it? Just how is that going to work? And we are embracing that, well, slightly challenging area of guidance on automated facial recognition and data analytics. I remember myself in the City of London, the absolute furore there was around digitally enabled waste bins, that when people walked past them, they could actually grab the data on the phones. And this was done, as there was also an experiment with bus stops, without telling anybody, other than the people who are involved directly in the trial. And it caused an absolute what's it storm, and, you know, quite understandably so. So we are also producing codes of practice on digital extraction and on information management. We have specialist programs too, and this is a great collaboration. The Institute of Cyber specialists, if you like, digital investigation professionals. And this is a kind of partnership in action, and the sort of thing where there are already 500 members from 73 different law enforcement agencies, and they're creating nationally consistent standards for operatives that are involved in cyber and in digital. It's now being piloted with academia and with private industry, and we're also creating a network within law enforcement and beyond to work collaboratively. So just to give you an example of what that means in practice, at a recent meeting, the National Crime Agency, the NCA, was discussing a case with HMRC, with trading standards, with HMP prison services, and with a regional unit. And this is something that hopefully we will build on in future months. What else are we doing right now? Well, the DII that I mentioned actually started in April 2020 with around, it's not a huge budget, a 4 million budget, but from the Home Office, and we're very grateful for that. Part of the project is a capability improvement hub that's going to work closely with forces, with NPCC, different areas of expertise, again, academia, the NCA and other experts, to understand what the current challenges are and the opportunities in the DII environment, and to anticipate future threats. And anticipating threats and opportunities is something that we've done in a piece of work about the future operating environment. I'll mention that in a minute, but that actually goes out to 2040. So practically scanning the digital environment to see what those opportunities and challenges might be, interacting with subject matter experts, and looking outside of just policing so that we are seeing the wider picture. And then we're reporting back to the college and also to all of the people that we collaborate with. So what have we learned about what we need to know for policing about digital crimes? What is the evidence? It's clear, obviously, that officers need to be trained and equipped to deal with even the simplest crimes. You cannot take it that because somebody has a mobile phone, they know how to do this stuff. And we've seen massive increases during COVID in the sort of crimes that can be done remotely, involving frauds. So there's been a huge uplift there. And use of, unfortunately, indecent images of children. That's projected. The difference between 2013-14 and 2020-21, we're expecting an 8 to 9% increase in that crime, and it is already huge. There are already backlogs in digital evidence simply because we don't have the capacity and the capability to deal with all of it. So our new entry routes do include training on cyber, but also something which isn't always popular in policing, continuing professional development. So I'd like to grab the controversy for a minute and say that in some areas of policing, CPD is viewed as not part of the day job. And the term abstraction, which is taking you away from the day job, is used to describe it. But in fact, we see it, and I'm sure it is, actually part of the day job to improve one's own learning. And it's just going to be necessary. Everybody will have to have this at some level. And we need funding across the whole policing system. It isn't just officers, it's obviously staff as well. So our analysis at the college showed that about, between 34% to 60% of the workload of DFUs, digital forensic units, is actually mobile phones. And between 2017, 2018, the average storage requirements for data more than doubled. The Internet of Things and 5G are going to increase the volume and complexity of what policing is expected to deal with. So we need investment, we need support to keep pace with that tech change. Obviously, there are benefits, which you can read the slides, so I don't need to repeat them there. But per annum, we're looking at over 300 exhibits per digital investigator that they have to tackle. What kind of crimes are likely to become a higher priority? Unsurprisingly, cyber terrorism, and that includes physical damage such as spoofing, impact on operational tech, disabling safety systems. Cyber terrorism aimed at disruption, hacking, network breaches, malware, denial of service attacks, all that kind of thing. And then crimes which use new forms of deception. I think back to my, if you like, earliest studies of encryption and the kind of things that perhaps the Romans used to do, which was shave a messenger's head and write a message on their head, let the hair grow back and then send the messenger off. Well, you may laugh. Now, technology is one route for doing this, but also, if you like, anti-technology, and where people are finding that the new techniques can be, if you like, detected, then they simply revert to the old method. So we have to be able to do both, from low-level blackmail to big-scale tech crimes that attack nation states. The use of drones, obviously, those have become much cheaper for civilians, and so they are being used in stakeouts of targets for carrying illegal weapons and drugs, not just in prisons, but of course outside of them as well. Now, the kind of work that we're engaged in involves never-ending puzzles, and I just chucked up a few here. I'm not going to read through the list. You may have heard of some of these types, but to pick out the simple poem codes, which special operations agents took, taking 5 words from a poem, they numbered them in alphabetical order, they used those numbers to transpose the message before it was sent, and they had an indicator key at the beginning. Again, as I was saying, stuff goes in and out of fashion, but we are now looking potentially at the quantum era. I was just reading about some of the first hacks into quantum codes, and perhaps we may even see the advent of cosmic codes. Quite frankly, anything that the human imagination can invent, then we have in the future the potential capability to do it. So the stuff that we're seeing most likely to be affected by tech in the future, we have dropped into a college assessment of the Future Operating Environment 2040. Now, this is, I'm not going to give you a huge amount of detail because this is actually embargoed till the 10th of August when we do a rollout. But it says that while it can be useful to think about the impact of each trend individually, it's the convergence of different trends, often in unforeseen ways, that will shape policing's future strategic context. And I'm sure that the same applies to tech. One of the trends is an expanding and unregulated information space. And with advances in tech creating opportunities and new ones for mass manipulation, our efforts to stop the spread of false, misleading and abusive online information will continue to evolve out to 2040. There is a changing landscape of trust. The digital era has ushered in new tech which allow people to sidestep existing actors and institutions and systems. Harnessing AI, but more especially machine learning, could be the most transformative tech of the next 20 years because of its ability to improve machines' ways of thinking intelligently, in some cases unethically, and also, autonomously. And that point that Carly was making earlier, just relating back to the importance of having public trust, by and large, predominantly the police have it at the minute, but it is a fragile thing and it can rapidly be eroded. So we have to make sure that we take the communities with us as we move forward in this journey together. So lots and lots of future challenges. In the emerging surveillance society, we need a clear value proposition for the tech that we're using. With regard to policing digital disinformation, some of the work the college needs to do is skilling people in how video and audio can be manipulated, the technical skills they need to spot it, the forensic expertise, and credentializing standards in that. And I mentioned building trust, so I won't dwell too further, except just to give you a very small low-tech example of an NPCC, National Police Chiefs Council form on digital extraction, which has now been withdrawn, is going to be reissued, but the form in itself caused ethical problems. So in shaping the future workforce, we need a really strategic approach and consistency. Policing is operating in conditions of increasing complexity, cybercrime, terrorism. There's much more organized, cooperation between criminals, and we need to organize across our systems as well. So this really is a future leadership activity for policing. We believe in leadership at all levels. When a police person comes in, staff or officer, they already exercise leadership functions. So the college is working on a new centre for just that. Just in summary, the human factors very much will kick into this. So it needs an alliance of tech and of human. In cyber, yes, it can be daunting, but I'm going to be very bold and say that anything that can be encrypted can also be broken. It won't be easy, but there are bedazzling shortcuts, and there have been around, right throughout history, that are ways of destroying randomness. An ethical and human factor, as I mentioned, but an ethical compass is crucial. There are court cases already identifying ethical issues around policing of the data protection world. We have the DPA 2018, GDPR, we have human rights, but the very good example about automated face recognition rings true, as does taking and extracting data from digital devices. So we are trying at the college. We've just pulled together the first concept and discussed that just yesterday with the Home Secretary and others for centralizing everything that we're doing on leadership and making sure that that responds to the exciting but the undeniably challenging landscape that we have up ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christine. And thank you again to Carly. Those were both really, really great presentations, lots of food for thought. We've got a little stream of questions there, and I'm sure there might be a few more coming through. So the first one I think probably is for you, Carly, and it's asking a little bit about how people might actually opt out of facial recognition. And really the role of ethics and governance panels and so on in perhaps enabling that and making that happen. And if I can just tag on to that, something that really occurred to me as you were talking is that difference between technology that we choose to use, like the contact tracing app, and technology that's imposed on us, like facial recognition. And I guess there are very different governance and ethical issues to be considered there. So, but practically, how can people opt out of facial recognition? How can we have the confidence in that, do you think?
So it's a good question. It relates, I think, interestingly, to a question later on about the mobile phone extraction report from the ICO, which is, so the notion that you can opt out of something suggests that consent is the basis on which the technology is being used. And that is, I'm sure as many of the participants know on this call, that's a kind of misunderstanding about how data protection law applies to the policing context, which is that consent is rarely the legal basis for the use of many of these technologies, because it's done in a, you know, under lawful powers that exist, or exceptions from the DPA according to the law enforcement directive. So the idea that you can opt out of something is transporting our understanding of data privacy in the commercial or online realm onto policing, which is not exactly the right fit. But it gets at, I think, something much deeper, which is the societal sense of choice and involvement and kind of agency, which we can give people, even if it's not about their legal ability to opt in or opt out of police use of facial recognition, which they will not have, particularly if it's being used in a kind of live situation. So what it actually gets at there is, and this is something that the ICO says in the mobile phone extraction report, which is even if consent isn't the legal basis on which you're doing this type of tech rollout, you still have to create an environment in which there is clear understanding of what's happening. There's a clear kind of evidence base for why the technology is necessary, and where possible, people feel informed as possible. And that's really broader questions, as you suggested, Jackie, around process and ethics, and also kind of public transparency. And I think hand in hand with that goes legal protections. The mobile phone extraction report calls for a draft code of practice on the use of that practice. And I think that is a really well-founded way to move forward with some of this new technology, which is, you know, obviously on the one hand, we don't want a proliferation of new codes of practice every time we've got a new piece of tech that police want to use. But on the other hand, when these new tech raise significant ethical and societal questions, having some type of explicit legal framework which deals with it does give the public more confidence. Being able to point to something which says, there's where it says that this particular type of tech can be used in these situations, does increase public trust. Whereas I think the de facto approach to some of this new tech is we can squeeze it in within existing powers. And that's sometimes by necessity, of course, because the tech moves faster than the powers. And, you know, we had the Investigatory Powers Act in 2016, but before that, 16 years since RIPA, for example. And, you know, the legislation simply can't keep up. And of course, it makes sense that police are, as they're building new types of digital skills into their policing capabilities, that they're seeing how they fit within existing law. But at some stage, we do need these types of explicit codes of practice or pieces of law, not only to help really make it clear how this tech should be used, but also to improve public trust and make people feel more confident.
Great, thank you. Maybe I can pick up, as you've already mentioned, the mobile phone extraction issue. There's a couple of questions here around that, perhaps for both of you, and including the code of practice. So somebody has asked if you're both familiar with the Information Commissioner's recent report on mobile phone extraction, and if so, how that impacts on issues that you've both discussed around data privacy, future codes of conduct, for instance. And then there's a specific question about the code of conduct, that if we're using AI and other technology, is the code of practice, oh sorry, that's for the code of practice, not the code of conduct, ready to prepare police officers specifically for new evolving roles. So maybe if we stick with the mobile phone extraction, if you'd both like to say a bit more on that. Should we go to you first, Christine?
Yeah, but I think we're revising the guidance. I think it would be right to say I'm aware of that report in general, but I couldn't quote you chapter and verse. I haven't actually got it to hand. But we're aware that the guidance, because things are moving so fast, is out of date, and we need to update it. In fact, we need to do a whole load of things. If I may, Jackie, I'd like to pick up on a wider question, but I think it's very related, that's been raised here. And it's this one fundamentally about how you police, where is the balance between consent and dissent, and how do you make those ethical judgments in policing, and some of them are ethical. So I can reply specifically for the college. One of my earliest moves on getting into the chair was to recruit Dr. Rabina Shah, who's advising us on diversity, equality and inclusion, but not just that, it's all in a well-being context, and also an expert on digital. And the reasons for that are that these are ethical issues, but you need to understand the background to them first. And I think, one of my own takes on this is that we can't all be experts in everything, and but we can't abdicate personal responsibility for having an understanding of some of the, if you like, the generality of the subject. So we have also at the college, we're in the throes of appointing a robust, independent ethics panel. Now that sounds all right on the face of it, but I am aware that in policing there are lots of ethics panels that exist. Some of them are better viewed than others. And so I don't think that will be enough. I think that from the college perspective, that's a good start. But I see us having more what I would call user panels and citizen panels, and using those where we've got a specific issue just to test, are we getting this right on behalf of what we do for policing? Because we have not got, obviously at the college, operation control over all of it. And do I think that policing always gets it right, and that we, therefore, as the college always get it right? Absolutely not. No, but we have to learn fast and put it right. And there is absolutely a legitimate right to lawful protest in this country. And, the training has to march in step with that.
Carly, would you like to say something about the mobile phone data extraction?
No, it's not anything I've looked into in any depth, other than to say, I mean, I know the report at a high level. It seems to me to be eminently sensible to update guidance on this particular practice. I think mobile phones are probably some of the most sensitive and kind of extensive personal data that police are handling, and it makes sense that a rigorous process should have to be gone through, not least because, as the report points out, it may deter victims of crime from reporting crimes if they know that they will have to have their mobile phone data extracted. So making sure there's a really rigorous framework for doing that is going to, again, improve public confidence.
There's a specific question for me on that, but I will come back to that in a minute. But just to say that this isn't all, if you like, some of the judgments that are being made in policing are not done with wrong intentions. I think in the early days of digital extraction, what happened was a tendency to grab everything off the phone and then take out what you needed, instead of doing specific searches to get what was required for the actual circumstance. And that was one of the things that, raised a lot of anxiety, quite understandably. So this was the origin for this is in not knowing how to use the tech properly, and secondly, not having the right tech to do a sophisticated job. So when I talked earlier about it needing investment, it does need investment. Phil, I'd like to say I could give you an exact date, but if you drop me an email, I will make sure that I let you, and in fact anybody else who's interested, know when that will be published. I'm not going to speculate off the top of my head, but we have been working flat out with COVID. We are in the middle of appointing a new executive director of standards for the college, and that person will be charged with revising, make sure we have all of the right processes, and that we pick up pace in the way that we did with COVID in revising all the standards and the guidance as quickly as possible. There's an awful lot to do.
Can I pick up, there's a couple of questions around the code of practice and whether or not codes of practice are going to prepare officers in the way you've talked quite a lot about capacity in shaping the future workforce and so on, but also CPD, Christine. So do we think that codes of practice are going to specifically prepare officers for these new evolving roles, and particularly around the really challenging demands of technology?
No, I don't think just codes of practice in themselves are enough. I think it's the entire piece about leadership in policing, really, and the learning and development that we provide policing with. But you can't just do that in, you know, in a classroom or whatever. It needs very much to be as mobile as possible, so that there's so much information out there, and you cannot expect police to remember everything or the most up-to-date version. So we need to be able to equip people with the means when they're on the way to deal with something, that they can just look on their phone and it is there for them. So it needs to be in between the, if you like, the formal learning. And we are convinced that, you know, professional development is the way forward for policing as well. But at the minute, it's not wholly viewed as a positive. It is part of the job in policing. I'm just...
So what, can I follow up on that a little bit, looking there at another question? So what are the prospects at the moment? It seems that there are pilots and developments happening at individual force level. So how do we regulate the use of technology in trustworthy and uniform ways across police forces? How do we put in place that guidance? Because as you say, as Carly said, we're quite often trying to sort of shoehorn the challenges of new technologies into things that were set out in PACE and codes of practice, you know, in the mid-80s. And I think the mobile phones are a really good example of that. If you think about just taking everything off a suspect's mobile phone, there are things there that you perhaps would never get a search warrant for if you had to go into somebody's home to get them. There are all sorts of complicated issues that kind of arise from that. So what sort of principled approach do you think is needed to ensure that we can sort of use that the policing can use that technology in the most ethical and responsible way, and with some degree of uniformity, rather than everybody kind of reinventing the wheel in their individual forces?
Well, I mean, either deliberately or unwittingly, you've put your finger on a big problem there, because at the minute there isn't common tech used across policing. There is no, it makes interoperability of technology really difficult, because there's an awful lot of customization. You know, there are a lot of purpose-designed products out there, and there is, at the minute, there is no central driving strategy that says this is how to do it. There is actually a national strategy on paper, but at the minute the resource, including money to fund it, is not available. So again, with the Home Office yesterday, we were talking, and the college is, you know, by no means in control of how all of this happens, but obviously we would like to influence. But we were talking about, how do we get that ubiquitous tech that makes it easy for everybody to talk to one another, and then to roll out good ideas so that they don't stay just kind of isolated in one area of the system. I was asked a bit of a question that might be a bit controversial, which I would just like to pick up on, which I think adversely commented on the use of Churchill in a College of Policing presentation. This was Churchill allied by, you know, with digital, if I can just point that out. It emanates from my days at Bletchley Park, as it happens. And Churchill was one of the early leaders who spotted the potential for the use of the tech that there was at the time, including at Bletchley, the world's first semi-programmable computer. So it was all about systematizing that use of data, and that's the reason why it's there. But one or two earlier slides were missed out, so I didn't make that entirely clear. My apologies.
Okay, there's also a couple of questions here around, which kind of follows on from that a little bit, around whether or not this focus on technology and so on tends to conflate legitimate dissent and peaceful protest with perhaps more serious activity, and to sort of reconceptualize those in some ways, particularly in kind of the security terrorism context. That's one question. And then another question around the use of AI and machine learning and so on. And if we think about the development of those, and there's some research to suggest that these impact very unfavourably on BAME communities, not least because the facial recognition software is trained on male and white faces, and therefore is likely to be much less accurate on female and non-white faces. So I don't know if you have any response to that. Maybe Carly, if you'd like to kick off.
Sure, I've just put a blog post in the chat actually of some early findings we've had from our Citizens Biometrics Council, which explore some of these issues around discrimination and identity that come up in the context of biometric systems. I think that there is a big challenge there around discrimination and AI-driven tech from two angles. One is from an accuracy angle. As Jackie just said, there's kind of demonstrated problems with some facial recognition tech that's related to data representative of the data sets on which the AI is trained. I think that that's probably fixable, or almost certainly fixable. But there is a deeper, more challenging question there, which is being much more fulsomely discussed in the US than it is in the UK, which is when particular types of biometrics technologies are used in policing contexts, which themselves disproportionately target people from certain communities, can the technologies themselves then kind of reinforce discrimination or structural, institutional inequalities? I think that is a starker problem perhaps in the US than it is here, or certainly it's been more widely explored there, but I think it's definitely worth raising here. It's clear that Britain has problems with structural racism like the US does. Britain has historical problems with over-policing of Black and minority ethnic communities, of people from certain religious backgrounds, etc. And so I think that there's just a question to be asked about how we ensure new technologies don't further exacerbate existing inequalities or structural discrimination. And then from the perspective of process, what do police forces need in terms of capacity to audit technologies that they are bringing on board? I'm thinking, for example, of predictive analytics tools. How can a police force scrutinize an off-the-shelf tool that they buy from a company for its own compliance with equalities and non-discrimination principles? And what types of technical capabilities do the police force need to do that kind of auditing is another challenge that is echoed in other domains. This is not only a problem within policing. So, for example, local authorities are using predictive analytics to identify children who are at risk of going into care. And there is a challenge, a kind of power dynamic between companies that are selling off-the-shelf tools and the local authorities who are purchasing them and don't have the in-house data capacity, data analytics capacity to really test and understand how's the system affecting beneficiaries. Is there bias in the system? Can we double check that and make sure it's not exacerbating inequalities? And that's about bringing everyone up to a level playing field to really have the skills to engage with that tech.
Is there anything you wanted to add, Christine?
Well, I absolutely endorse what Carly has said, but I think where we have to start with policing is that we have to acknowledge historically and in the current day that there have been problems with racism, and those have adversely affected, in particular, Black and minority ethnic communities. But I think we need to think about difference, not just in terms of race. There are other areas of difference that we have to make sure are not adversely targeted or picked up by this tech. And the human factor does come in here because machine learning is what it says it is. You teach the machine things it needs to know. So making sure that there is the right sort of human intervention in and checking at all stages of machine learning development is still crucial. You cannot just let it go and hope that's going to solve the problem. You have to ask the right questions. You have to share the right data. And you have to sit back and review from time to time that all is going as you expect it to.
And then I think so one final question here that a couple of people have chimed in, which is again about some of the potentially very negative consequences of more data-driven approaches. So somebody asks whether or not You agree that more data-driven approaches to policing seem to intensify the tendency to conflate legitimate dissent and peaceful protest with terrorism and sedition. I'm wondering what kind of training is or perhaps should be given to the police to distinguish between legitimate dissent and criminal disturbance, criminal activities.
Well, I think this goes back to a fundamental point that needs to underpin all our work in this area, which is about ethics. That really needs to be the cornerstone, as it was traditionally, of policing, because it is true in this country, and we at the college aim to do our part in continuing this, police by consent. And if you lose trust, you cannot do that. It's as simple as that. So I think when it comes to the use of technologies and the use of data, we do need to have better skills in statistics, better skills in understanding uses of data, applications of data. And at the minute, we're just kind of in the foothills of all of the work that needs to be done to prepare for that. It's probably going to be a very significant part of the college's agenda for the foreseeable future.
Carly?
I don't think I have anything further to add to that, actually. It's not in my domain, so
Right.
What Christine said sounds very sensible.
Yeah, and it is, as you say, Christine, it's a long-standing issue, and I think, do you remember all the publicity around, being a domestic extremist, which I remember the comedian Phil Thomas actually kind of made a big thing about that. And if you've been seen at several protests, you became a domestic extremist. And so just the language changed very quickly from just...
I think, another thing is the ability through using tech to manipulate images and manipulate words and present false and misleading pictures. That's why earlier on I said we need to be able to teach staff and officers in policing to recognize the signs for when something's being manipulated, and it's not always easy, and they also need tech to help them do that. There was the big question about how can policing place trust in some of the products. I think that's going to need a centralized national approach to do it.
So we're out of time. There are a couple of things here that maybe might take offline, or we can pass on to you. So some things around the Institute for Cyber Digital Investigation and how academia can get involved and so on. So we might be able to, I don't know if we can continue to post a few things on here. But I think all that remains now is to thank you both enormously for taking the time to speak to us, for really clear presentations, and for being willing to answer whatever questions are being thrown at you today. And I'm sorry we didn't get onto some of the other things around recruitment. I think that's also something certainly I'm interested in, and I'm sure that others are. But that'll have to be for another time. So it's weird, we can't give you a round of applause because we're here.
I think the only thing is, it would have been actually lovely to be able to speak to the people in the room, wouldn't it? Rather than, I just feel, I prefer to receive as opposed to just transmit. But I'm really grateful for the people who bore with us, and certainly with me, and listened and asked such thoughtful and difficult questions, quite rightly.
Yeah, lots of thanks coming through on the chat now. Okay, well, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
take care.
Bye bye.